On June 2, 2012, DGP, the Center for Design and Geopolitics, held its second annual conference. Entitled Designing Geopolitics 2, it was held in the Black Box Theater of Cal IT 2, the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology in La Jolla, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. So we'll have a 25-minute discussion for this panel as well. Jeffrey had to drop offline. He had an important client meeting, which is why he wasn't here. The World Trade Center Mosque wanted to borrow part of the Hollywood sign for this, and they needed it right away. So we're going to have so Tim Durfee, along with Daniel and Molly Steenson down here, will begin the discussion, and then we'll pass the talking stick around to you. So we'll try to keep it at a tight 25 minutes. And then the last panel, of course, is Daisy Ginsburg and Alyssa Anderson. So thanks very much.
Great. Great. Well, you know, this morning we were discussing these immeasurable, complex systems and policies. It's extraordinarily fascinating. And this afternoon, you know, the super heading is of design and its relationship to this earlier conversation. And so I feel that there's some role I have to insert some of the missing elements, perhaps, in those earlier conversations that make it specific to a design-related conversation. And at one level, how are things made in this realm? And it's not just a question of specific, you know, materiality. What materials do you work with? But how does one bring the vastness of these systems that we're working in, the complexities of these political systems, the immeasurability, the unownability of the data that we're discussing, and be able to locate it as a place for design. I guess I'm just starting with that, and there's plenty of else to build on this.
So, like the question, like really concretely, how do we work, or what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you start on a project?
Well, when I see like this morning and like the sessions like beginning this afternoon, I'm like so intimidated because we work so intuitively. So we basically almost all our work takes place around the idea of a hunch. You have a hunch about something and then you dive deeply into it. So it's always around. It's always about a combination of looking for the visual of these phenomena that we're interested in, looking for the relevant sources that we then, you know, start to seek out either by, you know, reading their work or finding out about them or even interviewing them or becoming friends eventually. Yeah. It's always kind of based on a sort of idea of being like super interested. Right. Yeah, and that you know, might bring you sometimes into proximity of people who are dealing with these questions as their job, you know.
What's interesting about your description right now is that it brings people into the conversation. All of a sudden, they're individuals that you're addressing and discussing who've done this research or engaged with it, and somehow they help to broker, you know, your role as a designer. The other thing that comes up for me is that at some level, you know, we as designers, we work through representation. And if you consider, you know, the world before industrialization, there's the thing in front of us and our senses are communicating that to us. Then things get very complex with political systems, economic systems, and so on. And then we need things like identity systems, right, to serve as stand-ins, as proxies for these vast, complex systems. Political, you know, we can't see the whole country, we can't deal with it. Therefore, we address its sovereign of some sort of, you know.
I mean, no one has ever seen the Roman Empire.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And same, of course, with corporations and so on. But there's a curious thing that's sort of turned around, it seems to me, that, you know, thinking about this morning and how it's well beyond the idea that these are complex political systems or complex data systems. It has as much to do with our relationship to that. It's not a task simply of representing it. It's that we navigate through it in different ways. A very easy to visualize example, I think, is Google Earth. You know, that we sort of navigate through this field of data that isn't just one whole thing. It's actually, as you know, a crazy quilt of sourced images from not just from the same period in time. Sometimes, you know, as old as a Landsat photo, right next to, one zoom up, you're going to an image that was taken a week ago. But regardless, that the paradigms of representation have fundamentally changed. And I'm curious, I mean, as a designer, does that alter our relationship to what it is that we do?
I would say totally. I mean, not necessarily Google Earth for me, because it's basically a finite set of data that you go through. But the logic of social media in particular, where people are becoming massively active in networks, and they do that without intermediaries. So to some extent, the designer is a classical intermediary figure who suffers the same blows at the moment as the library, like on the bookseller. Every intermediate figure is under pressure now. So you see that at this moment, the emergence of self-representation and self-communication in networks is the thing that designers have to look at. So it's no longer like, let these people first go to art school, let them do like 4 to 6 years of art school, and then they will know how to design. No, it's like we designers have to like keep up with them in many ways, which is the super challenging thing of today, I guess. Yeah.
I promise. Molly, do you want to chime in at all?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm struck by both through Jeffrey's talk and Daniel's talk, this notion of what is the material of design here? What is the material of a corporation? What is the material of a barrier? And how does this begin to change the purview of what designers do? I wondered if you could comment on how Metahaven sees its own material changing as it takes on branding, as it takes on the cloud, as it takes on corporation. I mean, what is the purview here?
I think we have different. There, you could answer this question different ways. I guess we have the material outcome of our work can be a website, a book, an exhibition. It can have many different outcomes. A prototype. But the problem is that it often doesn't start from a material starting point, but from a sort of immaterial notion or idea of intervention, either as a sort of speculative prototype, as with Face State, or as something that is directly applicable, like merchandising, for a whistleblower website. So for us, I would say the steadiness of the material production that used to typify a design practice maybe a couple of years ago, is completely interrupted by the virtual and by the notion that things exist on the internet and they exist without ownership, etc. And I guess in order to maintain a design practice, you have to always be you have to consider the material properties, because they are the ultimately useful thing for a client. For example, is the outcome. What I've just shown you is mostly our, let's say, research, and we of course also do design books. We design lots of things that could equally have talked about here, but it would not pertain so much to this question of design and geopolitics. So when it's about design and geopolitics, the material is completely fluid, I would say, and we have to really work at creating the boundary so that it becomes fixed and that it has endpoints. Because of course, if you do the research in this field, it's the next day your thesis can be old, but by what's just happened overnight. So there's ways that you have to set boundaries so that the outcome remains sometimes interesting or valid, irrespective also of these fast changes. Yeah, and that's how a radically simplified meme like LOL SOS comes about. That's something that will be true tomorrow, probably, and it was true yesterday. Yeah.
I was interested in how a little bit ago you referenced the individual within social networks somehow as being a party, in a way perhaps an audience to this, and which brings up another subject, which is Hart and Negri talk about in this era of a sort of mandate of political sameness, it brings new opportunity for cultural differentiation in certain ways, a curious kind of inversion. And a little ghost over there. But then also. Zizek talks about in this sort of new political landscape where with commerce crossing all sorts of territories and boundaries, or the total utter dissolution of those territories, that it puts a greater importance on the rights of the individual or rights, period, that are inviolate. And the only inviolate right in his identification is really for the individual not to be harassed. It comes down to the person. And I guess the point I'm trying to get to here is that for designers, we have to, in a way, have an audience. We have to have someone we're working for, a client possibly, if you want to call it that. But at a certain level, at the same time, of course, it's a reality to broker in these vast systems now. But there's a curious thing going on, which is that in the light of all of this expansion and dissolution of territory, of ever complexification of networks and so on, in a curious way, the individual becomes that much more important. And I don't know. I'm just more observing, I suppose, in your work that there's this kind of ever presence of sort of people in some way as individuals in the context of still these vast systems, perhaps ever more important. I don't know if you have anything to say.
Yeah. I would say that with regards to like network power, for example, which is this kind of key notion that we discovered in the work of David Grewal, and then further developed in the book with regard to branding. The issue with network power is that it is in a way, and it is a completely coercive form of power, because you don't choose for it. It sort of chooses you. It's sort of like, when you make the decision to open up a Facebook account, it's not because you love Facebook. It's because you feel, I might miss the boat. If I don't do this, my friends are on Facebook. I'm missing out on parties and events. So the implicit coercive threat behind Facebook is social death. And this is the words of David Grewal. It's not even our words. So you have social death. But on the other hand, and there is where the individual comes in, you have the agency that you can perform by having the account and by being connected on the network standard. So you have reach, you have, you can, leverage lots of things. You can, it will help you, likely. And that's the double bind of network power, which, has the individual as basically under coercion, but also free. Yeah.
Molly? Anyway? Yeah, okay. One more chance on Molly.
I don't have a direct response to that, but I am curious also about, again, we were talking earlier about transparent camouflage, and I'm wondering about the ways that this extends to different kinds of spaces. So on one hand, Jeffrey was speaking about the extension of the lobby and the manner in which lobby space and private public space is changing. On the other hand, we've been talking about data centers as the instantiation of the cloud. But I'm curious about this, again, this idea of transparency. I find myself putting it in tension with materiality, and seeing that the work of the designer is both, on one hand, to, I guess, highlight this, these discrepancies and these strange tensions, but on the other hand, it's I wonder to what extent it's possible that the work of Metahaven, or that the work of us as designers or architects, might also be creating new kinds of transparencies.
It's good that you come up with this, because we have been involved in the rewriting in a law proposal that's going to be proposed to Dutch Parliament. That's a reiteration of the Freedom of Information Act in Holland, because we think in Holland that we are incredibly transparent, but we're not. Our Freedom of Information Act dates back to 1980, and it's almost impossible to get documents from the government. And this new proposal, which has been initiated by the Green Left Party in Holland, is basically, one of the features of it is that the government proactively leaks instead of that we have to wait for it to leak and send all kinds of requests. So through our mutual friends, we became involved in this. And this has been a great opportunity for us to be more proactively, or to be on a more design level almost involved in how such a thing would look. And so with our friend Jonas Staal, we also are developing a kind of user interface to interact with this information. Might it become available? Because the big problem of freedom of information is that that of course once you have it, it's too much. So how to trickle down the amount so that it comes down to units that you can work with, and that is something that will premiere like at the end of next week in Amsterdam. So I can't say too much about it, but it will. We're very excited about that. And yeah, it became suddenly very positive again, this notion, because this is not black transparency. This is not involuntary transparency. This is voluntary transparency, undergone by a government. But then we have to see how the Dutch political situation evolves and, if it will be accepted.
Questions in the audience?
Yeah, I just wanted to... this is on? Just to pick up on what you said about the sort of implicit coercion. Actually, it's explicit, right? If you look at any of the sort of manuals or any of the sort of guidelines for designing any social, mobile, local, SOMO, cloud web app, they're explicitly about how do you maximize the browse time and how do you maximize the frequency with which you come back. And actually, somebody who's actually created a web app, I know that this conversation comes up again and again. How do you get people to feel, frankly, anxious about what they've missed when they're away? But the thing I wanted to say was actually that hasn't that always been the task of a designer, is this kind of coercion? Come back to church, or read this whole book. Or
the coercion of the user interface or the experience is only to be experienced in full when you've signed up. So network power is on you until the moment, is something that persuades you to sign up. So before you've signed up, it can't be the fact that you see your friends that you're already interacting with your friends on the platform, because you're in the process of being coerced to sign up, right?
Well, that's, I suppose, the frustrating thing about clout.
Yeah. Clout.com, you mean? Yeah, as opposed to the cloud in general.
No, Clout, the web service which ranks.
Yeah, clout.com. Yeah. Which ranks you according to Dabbler, Networker. There's all these sort of rankings. Anyway, yeah, it's hilarious. Also, we have more on that. But anyway, and there's even this book called Don't Make Me Think, which was once written about the Amazon user interface, and it was supposed to be the ideal interface because it didn't make you think, you just did. You just clicked, you became the completely intuitive, sub-thinking animal, just clicking away. And that's, of course, the logic on which these, interface designs and thrive, absolutely. You could say, has that always been the task of designers? Certainly, it has always been the task of some designers, but other designers have sought, to make people think, and they have sought to make people reflect. And of course, that particular strand of design is now undergoing very heavy weather, of course, under the influence of the social networks, etc. But I would argue that there has never been one type of designer, but many types. But the type that you're arguing for or arguing about, basically the designer as a sort of smoothener, the designer as a facilitator, the designer as someone who basically guarantees intuitive interaction, has been very important since industrial, I guess, since there are machines.
I guess what I'm referring to, though, is that, I can't think of any architect who's designed something to be uncomfortable so that you don't ever experience it, or that somebody who's designed this is less about the thinking part, and of course there's always a coercion to make you think, and more about just the role of design is, at least in many senses, is to present a possible model of the world, and to that extent, the presumed proposition is that this is something that's worth looking at, if you see what I mean. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't necessarily think that what you're describing is a new phenomenon, or that it's just limited to the network. What the network facilitates is the scale, right? And the geographical scale as well as the sort of diminishing time scale, if you see what I mean.
Surely, but you could say that when you designed a brown transistor radio in the 1960s, your design would be a good design. You know, the whole Apple iPhone strand's been based on that type of design. But if you talk about, there's one anecdote that should be mentioned here. That is like an experiment that was carried out, I believe in the 60s, with if you are supposed to meet with your friend in New York City, but you haven't set a time and a place, and then where are you going to meet? You don't have a cell phone. You can't find out. You know, where are you going to meet? And it turns out that a majority of recipients said at 12 o'clock noon, in the central concourse of, like, the main concourse of Grand Central Station. So these are focal points. That's like a typical focal point. And in a way, the social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and all the others have become our focal points for social interaction. So in that way, they have an enormous pool that traditional products didn't have. Even though there could be popular products, the fact that one person buys one radio doesn't exclude some person in another part of the world from buying another type of radio. And now with Facebook, we have that pool on a global scale. So in that sense, the dynamics are not new, the logic is not new, but the gravity of it is new. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the problem that you've identified in the work, very, very beautiful work, and also Jeffrey, who's not with us anymore, but extraordinary work, is trying to identify the site where action is possible. You know, and it seems like, I'm going to make a reference to popular culture, there's a kind of a ethical failure in the final image in the film V for Vendetta. Even though 2005, that ethically compromised image then becomes extraordinarily powerful, because for those of you who don't remember or might not have seen the film, it ends with a huge crowd facing off a armed government force, and the crowd is all wearing Guy Fawkes masks, which is an image that's now become extraordinarily familiar to us. Of course, that's trying to echo back through the entire history of resistance. And that image, which is compromised in the film, then through some kind of post-cinematic space migrates out into the world and becomes a trope for both resistance in the field and an image of resistance. And it seems like your work is really deliberately playing with the kind of value of those kinds of tropes. But then I have questions and doubts that emerge, right? So your work goes out into the world and it starts provoking people to think. And so the act of design in your work is to provoke people to think. Then I think about the fact that Critical Art Ensemble, you know, back in the 90s, the mid-90s, was making arguments in their electronic disturbance about the ineffectivity of operations in public space. But then we think, well, public space is constituted in different ways, like your Face State project, which is a dystopic view of what it could become, but nonetheless it's a constitution of public space. Then I become optimistic and I think of Anonymous, then I become pessimistic and I think about the fact that massive addressability and deep addressability, in the sense that it's been discussed today and in Ben's work, not only is positive, but can be very, very negative in the sense that everything can be tracked. And the idea of almost a Philip K. Dickian Scanner Darkly, the kind of world of Ubik, a dark world of Ubik, is the world we're actually moving towards. And so this is partly a kind of a question to Daniel, but partly also a kind of a meditation on what we're facing, because the kind of compromises of individual and collective agency seem to be constantly oscillating back and forth between the ability of work like yours to produce really dramatic shifts in consciousness, and then the flip side of the condition which your work is identifying, which takes away the advances that we make.
Thank you for the beautiful reflection. But yeah, I think that our worries about face state and about, you know, like total control and everything has to do not so much with the idea of there being social networks and protocols, but with the centrality of their architecture. So the idea that you have a global sociability, but it's concentrated in one or two mega corporations, that is the thing that sounds all too familiar. So I guess the more optimistic way out of this dystopian future is to imagine, in a really old-fashioned way, alternatives. So to imagine that you could have the good thing of the social connectivity minus the bad thing of the sort of centralized corporation. And I guess that is the the most for us the most positive way of dealing with the question, because otherwise you would end up in some sort of categorical rejection of the condition that we're in, and like the things that it nevertheless makes possible.
I actually just want to chime in with a different perspective, which is that, to say the most blatant truism of the day is that these all are pendular swings, and that at about 150 years or so ago, we were engaged with another dawning of the pre-modern age and industrialism, and in the art world, it was the total work of art that was the cultural response to that, a sort of assertion of human expression across all scales as this great sort of thing. But of course, then that becomes embraced as a type of totalism, that it becomes identified with a political kind of way of seeing. And so in a way, design, in this case art, became, by accident possibly, who knows, but in a way influential, or at least embraced by political factors, or at least associated with it. And it comes and goes, and then there become critical reactions to that, the sort of the real flowering, if you will, of modernism in architecture was clearly a reaction to the eclecticism that was associated with these other things. Anyway, so it comes and goes, and it'll be interesting to see what the reaction to this form of network work is. Yeah. Anne.
But I wonder if there isn't a difference, and this is related to the fact that the role of the interface now is quite different from, say, a printing press or a stove, or something that's physical and that's in front of you. And what we're talking about right now, all day today, is these systems that are so large and complex and largely unseen. And I love your comment about you could never see the Roman Empire. And the thing that design does is gives a face to these unseen things. And so I wonder if you could reflect on that difference, if there is one, or if it is in fact analogous to historical precedents.
That's again a really large question. Yeah. But you could say that insofar design has given a face to these entities, the conclusion of our work is that many of these visualizations are arbitrary. So and that really culminates in the notion of the logo, which is, I guess, is a notion that we're slowly leaving behind in design, and instead we now celebrate the standard, either through Twitter, Facebook, or we celebrate the national flag, as in the extreme right movements that are now all over Europe, where the flag is suddenly bigger than the logo. So designers have always had to fight for their legitimacy to visualize. And one example that I want to make here in relation to the Occupy movement is that more than one Wall Street affiliated design firm has proposed logos for Occupy Wall Street. There is a well-known firm that designed the identity for Chase, for JP Morgan Chase and Chase Manhattan Bank, that claimed that was invited by someone writing for the New York Times at that moment to propose a logo for Occupy, and they did. And that's the sort of the imperial notion of design, that it doesn't even question what it can do before it does it. That really is something that we better think about now twice. That is really a moment where we should think about. That's no longer design for me.
Oh, one more? Okay. All right.
I just wanted to bring up the term sovereignty again, because we haven't actually ever addressed it in also the other questions in the morning. Okay. Well, what happens is transparency. We've been talking about it as almost like a system of see-through, and actually it's a system of broadcasting, right? So even in the very basic idea of transparency of a glass, what we have is a near material condition. It's a photon passing through, and we think we're seeing the other side, because the outside is actually either reflecting in or vice versa. So it's being passed through, it's being explained. So for a cloud, that's even more clear, that if so far we've been able to always understand things to follow, for instance, understand like in branding, by a demarcation of a target. So target has been a word in discourse very clear, that there's an objectification of something within a context that then doesn't, is kind of staying in the background. What we have with cloud sovereignty is that we would have to have definitely a model where the background becomes the foreground, and there will be a clut of validation procedures and the way to a kind of a need for a platform to design how those validations would work. So I wonder if, because you were coming from branding and you coming from design and architecture, if you've dealt with that problem of how to deal with the possibility of the need of a visualization of that other context that needs to come through when transparency is what it is trying to be designed.
How do we go through the hyper-complex architecture of this remark? Question.
Exactly.
It is, yeah.
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say that I would just answer possibly by giving different words. That it is perhaps a less profound word, which is context in a certain way. I mean that all these conventions that are figure ground, all of these things that are the fundamentals of spatial relations and so on. They're not irrelevant actually in this discussion, in as much as they're ways of isolating figures and nameable things. And in this case, transparency is at some level, it's a metaphor, really, is the way we've been discussing it. And it was interesting that you brought in a material metaphor back to help illuminate that. But once again, I think that my answer to that would be yes, that is an issue to be, I think, identified. It's just so brand new in this particular way it's being framed, it seems to me, that that every answer I could possibly give would be unbearably literal. I have to just confess. I feel like there are all forms of transparency in terms of the economics of any given project, or of obviously material transparency, but at least in the realm of architecture, it's either too big or too literal that I would fashion as an answer. I don't know.
Well, if you look at sovereignty as a capacity of to have judicial and military undisputed power in a certain spatial unit or territorial unit, then you could say that cloud sovereignty now would mean the escape of the cloud from these sovereign these various existing sovereign forms of power, which is a very naive way to put it, because that comes down to the old Metahaven Sealand dream, basically. There is the Pirate Bay now proposes like airborne servers that are escaping jurisdiction because they're up in the air. And the answer, in the long run, would that really take off? The answer would be that the airspace would become the subject of sovereign, projection of sovereign military judicial power. So there is always this game that's played between, that sort of sovereign space of the nation state and the network that tries to escape it. And that has been going on since John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which declares both the idealism and the naivete of the idea of a sovereign cloud eventually. And now with the cloud, with the scale of the cloud, the weight of the cloud, the way that its architecture is organized, I guess it would become double as difficult to think of this sovereign question, because like in the 1990s, someone might have had a homepage hosted in the country where he or she had citizenship. Then in the early 2000s, that homepage might be eliminated, might have become a Blogspot account with a YouTube account, and then now it's a Facebook account or a Twitter account. And the agency and the leverage that people have with these social media increases their reach enormously, but also with regard to sovereignty, their data gets concentrated in smaller and smaller amounts of different jurisdictions. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Thanks.